Well, welcome everybody. I'd love to introduce Jonathan Levine and Jeffrey Smith from Princeton, who've been looking at, well, the large-scale picture of biodiversity, how it evolves in the face of climate change. Welcome.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to speak today, and thank you, Greg, for the invitation. So normally I would give a presentation like this just myself, but I felt like with our sort of potentially quantitative and analytical audience involved, it might be nice to bring Jeff in on the call to present his work, because that way, if we get questions that are on the more analytical side, Jeff's available to answer those questions. So I would certainly be out of my depth if we got to actually how we're putting together some of the computational modeling here. Anyways, our research group examines the interface of biodiversity and climate change. And our motivation is that we're all very well aware at this point that the Earth's climate is warming, and we're also seeing changing patterns of precipitation across the globe as well. And ecologists, when confronted with this sort of situation, have often gone into nature. And this is something I did, for example, 25 years ago. This is actually my slide. We go into nature, we try and mimic some future climate condition today to understand how that will impact biodiversity. And these experiments are actually remarkably, efficient and effective at getting those answers, but they're very constrained towards addressing the small scale changes that can happen when climate changes. But we also know that one of the biggest ways in which climate change is going to modify the fate of individual species and biodiversity is by reshuffling the competitive interactions. And in particular, we know, for example, that plants that are found in the environment that we're looking at here might face entirely new competitors as new species find habitats formerly unsuitable, suitable under the warmer climate. And what this does is bring species into contact with each other that don't actually interact in today's environment. And this can be a real challenge to try and get a handle on, first of all, how much is going to happen and what the impacts of those kinds of interactions might be. So to sort of cartoon this scenario out, I want you to think about different species that are arrayed along an environmental gradient. This environmental gradient might be alpine gradient, so an elevation gradient underlain by temperature or moisture. And then you can imagine that each species is depicted here by the distribution along the environmental gradient that it finds suitable. So each one of these histograms or distributions is meant to indicate or to map onto the habitat suitable for different species shown by different colors here. And then you can imagine that if the climate changes in such a way that environments which are suitable today in the future are simply found up gradient, we expect the taxa to migrate in that general direction as, for example, the climate warms. But the key is that we don't expect this migration event to be sort of synchronous across all the species. So some species, like the red one in my cartoon, will migrate very fast, and others, like the blue one in my cartoon, will migrate very slowly. And what this does in the future is create interactions between species, in this case, the red and the blue, which don't actually interact in today's environment. And we call these sort of novel competitive interactions that emerge under climate change. And we want to understand how these interactions we don't see today will actually affect the fates of biodiversity in the future. This, of course, is a challenge. So I'll put my obvious question up here at the top, and that's how do novel competitive interactions shape species' responses to climate change? So addressing this question, as I've already alluded to, can be a challenge because it's very hard, for example, to examine different interactions that we don't see in today's environment under climates in which they don't occur in today's environment. But you can somewhat get around these limitations by taking an experimental approach, as we do in alpine environments. And alpine environments are quite special for this because we see very dramatic climate change over very short geographic distances. So for example, here's our field site in the foreground. This is in eastern Switzerland. And you can see plants at around 2,000 meters. And these plants, are only about 600 meters away from a climate at the top of that ridge that corresponds to a habitat that is about 3 degrees colder. So that corresponds basically to the overall extent of climate change that we expect to happen over the current century. And this allows us to make some very concrete predictions about what kinds of competitive environments and what kinds of climate environments these plants will face in the future. So we thought very hard about what kind of scenarios we wanted to think about in this habitat. And we came up with two, there were more, but there's two I'm going to present today, which focus on the fate of a green plant that's shown here, that's found at around 2,000 meters. And you can imagine that this plant is found under a current climate shown in yellow, and with a current set of competitors that are also shown in yellow. Now, 600 meters down elevation, there's a different set of plants that the plant basically rarely sees. But these plants could ostensibly migrate into the environment if the climate were to become suitable for them under 3 degrees of warming. And that indeed corresponds to the difference in climate that you'd have between 2,000 meters and 1,400 meters in the alpine. So what we really wanted to understand was, does it matter for the fate of this focal green plant? Or this could be a plant species we're looking at the trailing edge of its range, so the part of its range that's not migrating at the leading edge under warmer climates. Does it matter for this plant whether under the warmer climate of the future it faces its current competitors, or it faces this low elevation set of competitors that would migrate in because the climate is now suitable for them in the future? So to do this, what we did was we took an experimental approach where we tried to create these different competitive and climate environments today. So what this basically meant was going into the alpine. You can actually see a picture of me doing it with one of my postdocs in the lab. And we tried to create the different competitive and climate environments of the future in today's world. And we can do that because these alpine plants, you can basically take a knife and you can cut them out of the ground, an individual plant. They're clonal perennial plants. And then you can place these plants into the different competitive or climate environments that you wish to subject them to in the future. So for example, to create scenario 1, we take individuals of our focal plant, we place that plant into a plot that's composed of its current competitors, which are the ones we depict in yellow. And then because that interaction takes place under the warmer climate of the future, we then place that entire community 600 meters downslope to 1,400 meters. And this then subjects this sort of competitive interaction to the warmer climate of the future. And then of course here, to create scenario 2, we do the exact same thing, but we place the focal plant into a plot that's composed of its novel low elevation competitors. And this of course is also placed at the 400-meter warmer climate of the future. Now, I can't help but show you how we actually do this because it's quite humorous. This is actually a this is a video of us actually creating one of these competitive plots that we want to now move to lower elevations to place our focal plants into. And you can see that the alpine community is remarkably transplantable. So you can go in there with sort of a flat-headed spade and you can pry the alpine meadow out of the ground. And we're below the rooting zone for these plants. They're not terribly disturbed by this action. It of course is a very heavy plot, but you can roll it like a carpet onto a tarp, which allows 4 people at least to pick up the corners and move it around, and they can smooth out the surface so they're all at the same depth. And then once this alpine meadow has been transplanted, you can see it moves almost like a lawn sod. You can then pick it up. You could stack these turfs about 4 or 5 tall into these large bags, and then you can use a helicopter to pick up those bags and transport them down to the lower elevation sites. And then our team will be available at this lower elevation site. They dig holes in the ground that are the approximate depth of those turfs. We then plant them into those holes. This is all done in fall when the plants are pretty dormant. And then after the snow melts in spring, these plants find themselves in the warmer climate of the future, just in a different location. And then we get some really cool results. So here, for example, is our basic kind of result that emerges from the experiment. But I'm showing you our results when our focal plant competes with the current community, where the results are shown in yellow, and when it competes with a novel low elevation community, where the results are shown in orange. And I'm showing you a very important demographic rate, their survival. And I'm showing you this result for 4 different focal plants, 4 different green plants, for example. And what you can see is that their survival is actually markedly reduced when they're competing with these novel low elevation competitors under the warmer climate of the future than when they're competing with their current competitors. And this really provides proof of concept that indeed these novel low elevation competitors and their invasion of the habitat provide sort of a major force shaping the demography of these plants under climate change. And I can also show you here on the right that the probability of them flowering, another important demographic rate, their reproduction, also changes under climate change.
So
yes, great, go for it. Yeah.
The impact of the changing climate from the competition from the new community, because you've done both in this situation.
Exactly. So you're correct that in this comparison, we are combining a climate change and competitor change scenario. And I want to say that this is an important thing to do because what we're trying to simulate is a case where the climate is indeed warmer in the future. So it makes sense to examine cases only when we're looking at warmer climates. But this does raise the question of, are these plants somehow being differentially harmed by the warmer climates? Is the climate what's driving these results, not the changing competitive environment? And I can tell you that I didn't show you the results, but we do the exact same experiment without any competitors at all. So we basically just bring the soil from the higher elevation side down and plant our focal plant into those different different climate environments with no competitors present, but the right soil present. And then we can see that in fact these plants actually grow even better at low elevation when they're with there's no competitors there, as long as they're with the warmer climate. So we know this is not a climate effect. It is indeed an effect of the competitors themselves. We're just doing it under the right climate to make sure we're making the right inference about the future.
So this sounds like a lot of the more extreme climates. I'm thinking mangrove forest and salt water, I guess alpine flowers, which they're specialized for living in more extreme environments. And when everything warms and the environments are more favorable, their adaptations are just not that valuable. And so they're being outcompeted.
That's exactly correct. It's not always what we find, but in this particular scenario that I'm showing you here, you're making the exact correct interpretation, Greg.
Got it.
Okay, so this, of course, is a bit of a cartoon, this experiment that I've showed you. And it doesn't really sort of get you good senses of the time scales which these communities are going to change, or what role even time lags play in driving the fate of these plant communities. And a very reasonable question is to say, well, this is what will happen maybe eventually when these low elevation competitors get there, but this might take 100 years. This could be well beyond the time scale of our management decisions or even our appreciation of what we're trying to conserve from a biodiversity preservation standpoint. So there's a bunch of follow-up questions that we were very interested in. And one thing that you might be wondering is, well, if it takes a very long time for these low elevation competitors to arrive, maybe what really determines the fate of biodiversity in the alpine is not these low elevation competitors, but even simply the changing interactions amongst the plants which are currently found together in these alpine environments. And so that's something that we wanted to address. We wanted to get a sense of how fast these communities can change. And in particular, we wanted to understand how important are these ecological time lags in governing these dynamics. What I mean by that is that even if we envision the alpine environment changing with a 3-degree increase in temperature immediately, overnight, we're not going to see an immediate shift in that alpine community. It will take time. These are long-lived plants. They can survive for 20, 30 years. It will take a long time for those dynamics to play out. And so we want to understand what role these time lags play in shaping these dynamics. And so, these kinds of questions that I'm showing you here are in some ways too nuanced to address with the blunt experimental approach I showed you in the prior section of the talk. And this brings us to the point where we begin to incorporate mathematical models informed by the kinds of experimental approaches that I described to make projections on a more sort of, a near-term time scale about the fate of these plants in the alpine under climate change. And let me show you how we do that. So this is work that was led by a grad student in the lab, Sebastian. And so we did the same approach that I began with already. So we're looking again at our same site in eastern Switzerland. We take alpine meadows that are at 2,000 meters and bring some back to 2,000 meters, and others get moved to increasingly warm elevations, all the way down to 1,000 meters, where this is subjected to a 5-degree increase in temperature, which of course is very extreme. But what this does is give us a gradient in climate that you can examine the interactions of these different alpine plants in today's time frame. And what we can then do is examine how the interactions between any two species change as you ramp up the climate in a more continuous fashion. And this is very important because this allows us to examine what will happen with real climate change, where we don't go through a step change in climate, but we actually amp up the climate change in a more gradual fashion. So what we do is we bring these plots down to all the elevations. Here's one, for example. And then what we do is we carefully map all of the individuals that belong to all of the species in these plots. And I will admit this was done by brute force, human eyes, but of course you can imagine that a computer vision approach could lead a more efficient sampling technology. But what's valuable then is we locate all the individuals that are in these plots of all these species. And not only do we look at their location, but we also indicate their size. And so each one of these circles corresponds, for example, to a location of an alchemilla, one of our common alpine plants. And the circle size corresponds to its size in the year 2017 and in the year 2018. And why this detailed mapping is so valuable becomes clear when you start envisioning overlaying these maps over one another from one year to the next. And then what you can see is there's a lot of very important demographic information that's rooted in these maps. So for example, if we have a circle that's blue, this indicates a plant that was present in 2017, not present in 2018, indicating a mortality event. We also have cases where we have a plant that's present in 2017 and is now bigger in 2018. This corresponds to growth. And then we also have circles in 2018 that don't correspond to a presence in 2017, and these correspond to recruitment. And this gives you the three main demographic weights you need to build a model of the dynamics of these plants. Now, if we built a single species model, we'd be good to go. But let me remind you, we want to understand how these plants and their interactions are changing under the climates. So what we do is we then overlay these maps for all the species. And then you can imagine that we now have the fate of each one of these circles, let's say a survival event, as a function of the surrounding competitors that these plants are finding themselves in these plots. And then we build basic, very simple demographic models. And I'm making a generic version of the model. We can build it for survival, for growth, or for recruitment. And what we basically say is that the demographic rate of a species I is equal to some innate demographic rate that we're calling lambda, so innate ability to survive. And then there's some effective competitors. And there can be competitors that are intraspecific of your own species and competitors that are of other species that are shown by this alpha ij. And importantly, these lambda and these alphas scale the densities of competitors in the neighborhood of a focal plant. These themselves are allowed to be to be climate dependent. And then we fit statistical models to all of the transitions of our demographic rate, let's say survival from one year to the next, as a function of some innate rate that's climate dependent, as a function of competitive environments and these interaction coefficients, which scale competitors to the demographic rates of these plants. And then what we have here then, ultimately, is a spatially explicit individual-based model for the fates of all of these individuals in these plots as a function of their competitor identity, where they're located in the plot, the temperature, as well as the competitive environment they're finding themselves in. And this, of course, ultimately requires a fair amount of computational power to run, but we can then now run different kinds of simulations of what these plant communities will look like under different kinds of climate warming scenarios. Here we have three commonly modeled representative concentration profiles. These are basically different scenarios of CO2 emission in the atmosphere. So RCB 2.6 keeps climate change at around a degree and a half. RCB 4.5 gives you about 3 degrees of warming. RCB 8.5 gives you, 5 degrees of warming, 4 to 5. And we can then use this trajectory, this projected trajectory of climate change in our habitats in Switzerland to drive our model forward with its climate-dependent interactions in demography. So here, for example, is the fate of Alchemilla, the plant I've been using as a test case. And you can see that, we started off at some abundance in the plots. And then you can see that if under the cooler scenarios, it actually declines over time. Under the warmer scenarios, it actually begins to increase. It initially declines, but then once it gets warm enough, it begins to increase. So we can see that Alchemilla actually proves to be a heat-demanding species that might actually benefit from climate change. Now, what's also very powerful with these models is you could also do sort of thought experiments. You could say, well, what's the importance of Alchemilla's long-lived life cycle in preventing its eventual decline under climate change? Or that we see, for example, in the cooler scenario. And we can run a scenario where, for example, at each time step, we let the dynamics play out indefinitely under the climate of that time step before advancing to the next climate scenario of the following year. And what this does is allow the community to always be in equilibrium with the current climate. And therefore, we can then ask what would be the dynamics of Alchemilla under an RCB 4.5 scenario if it didn't have a long-lived life stage that allowed it to buffer unfavorable periods. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty around these projections, but you can see that actually our median fate of Alchemilla is actually a major decline over time without its time lags to protect it while the climate is currently unfavorable for it. And then we can do this for all of the species, and we can calculate an overall Shannon diversity, and we can plot diversity over time in these plots, these alpine meadows, with time lags in the black line and without time lags in the dashed line. And this is just meant to show you that, in fact, we can actually get some quite detailed diversity projections for these habitats driven by real data on plant community response to climate and competitors, real climate forcing functions that give us sort of a holistic picture of the alpine under these warmer scenarios. And it always comes down to this coupling of these demographic models with our detailed climate experiments. I'm happy to stop if any questions before I move on.
Yes, actually, one good one is so you have a model of the plant growth, a conditional, if I'm interpreting correctly, on the other species, the plant growth
Correct.
phenomena, recruitment, growth, and death, conditional on temperature and other species. What I didn't get is how spatial it is. Do you bother saying that my nearest neighbors are this other species, or just the average distribution of other species in the whole plot?
We do a spatially explicit one where we actually have a interaction distance. So we basically the plants only see, for example, individuals that are within 15 centimeters, for example, of their basal rosette. You could run exactly what you're suggesting, Greg, a mean field model where you have a average density which rises and falls, and that determines the dynamics of the plants as well. But we chose to do the spatially explicit model in part because these spatially clustered interactions themselves drive the fate of these plants in their own way that we wouldn't want to homogenize away by running a mean field model.
Right. And then another question is, as you expand this, so this is somewhat easier, obviously, for grasses and like fast growing plants that you can actually move around. Whereas I'm thinking trees,
Yeah.
which are the drivers of large ecosystems, but they grow far more slowly. Having said that, there are ground inventories, at least in some parts of the world. Is that feasible to take existing ground inventories to train models of this nature, or is it just not representative enough?
In short, you can. I think the challenge is that there's some kinds of climates that the species might not be found in today because they are quasi in equilibrium with their climate. So the advantage of the experimental approach is you can basically say these are plants that have never seen 5 degrees of warming, but they will if it warms sufficiently fast, and you can impose that upon the environment yourself. With trees, you don't have that luxury. I mean, you could do seedling level experiments, but you can't do sort of canopy level tree experiments that are manipulating climate at that scale. That's the challenge there. So, in many ways, these alpine environments we pick because they're so tractable, but you're exactly correct. There's a limitation that's imposed by the tractable nature in trying to extrapolate our results to other systems.
Is it so in more northern forest, you do have a process of literally this migration, like trees species are just racing up to higher latitudes. Is
Exactly.
that informative enough? Or urban forests? They're just artificial things that are just people just dumped a bunch of nice-looking trees in the same spot.
Yeah. That's a very good idea. I mean, to use sort of the urban heat island effect to examine, quasi-natural forests that happen to be enclosed in a sort of concrete, solar radiation absorber belt. And I can't think of hand studies that have done it, but I'm sure someone has. But certainly tracking the migration of species under climate change can reveal information about the species, climatic tolerances and what sets them in motion. And that coupled with some more abstract modeling approaches could be useful. I actually think that the approach that Jeff's going to talk about next, that we apply in that case specifically to mammals and vertebrates, could be applied to the tree case to try and get at some of the same questions. But it is always a challenge because by their very nature, the competitors you face in the climate that you're in are very correlated. And one of the challenges is trying to break that correlation because that's in fact what climate change will do in the future. And we don't often have that presented to us today in today's world.
So then one last question, and partly is going to be for the next section, is what's up with bugs and pests and all these animal species that start messing with the trees and
Yeah, so I can tell you that, we were very interested, particularly in this novel competitive environment portion of the presentation, to ask questions about bugs, in part because, as you can imagine, bugs move much faster than plants do. Yeah. And that can create really interesting mismatches where you have alpine plants that haven't migrated dealing with low elevation insects which come along and munch them, in part because these plants are basically not very well defended. They're dealing with cold temperatures as their major selective force. Lower elevation plants are dealing with herbivore pressure all the time. And we were interested in the idea that maybe these low elevation insects would migrate in and just munch these high alpine plants, even facilitating the arrival of the low elevation competitors. So we did some experiments along the lines of what I already showed you, where we actually enclosed insects in big cages that we trap from different elevations and try and do the exact same thing. Unfortunately, we never got any sort of clean results from that, but you're 100% correct in thinking about what's going to happen with them. And they're, in some ways, a little bit more easy to think about because they don't have these long dispersal lags that plants do. The climate can be suitable for a plant at 100 meters, but it's going to take a long time for it to get to that 100-meter distance.
Got it. Well, thank you.
Hope that's helpful, yeah. Cool. Okay. So just sort of to start shifting gears a bit, I've given you, in some ways, our most experimental work, as well as work that kind of interfaces experiments with models. And now we're going to move towards more of a statistical modeling approach to address the flip side of this arrow. So I've already talked a lot about how climate change affects plant communities. But of course, we're also using plant communities increasingly to change the trajectory of climate change. So we are doing large-scale reforestation efforts or afforestation efforts or bioenergy cropping to try and use plants to sequester carbon so that we don't have as much climate change as we otherwise would. And these land-based climate mitigation efforts we know should work for addressing climate change, but we're not quite sure what they're going to do for biodiversity. And as you can imagine, transforming large amounts of the Earth's surface towards different kinds of vegetation in the efforts to curb climate change might have some very large biodiversity impacts. So here we're not asking about climate change's direct effects on biodiversity, but we're really asking about what will the actions that we do to address climate change themselves do to affect biodiversity. And I wish I could say we could do this all with plants because it's a very closed system, but as it turns out, there's a lot better data available for vertebrates. So we're actually going to address this question on the vertebrate scale. But let me sort of back up a little bit and tell you why we might be interested in using plants to address climate change. So many of you are well aware that our business as usual trajectories for greenhouse gas emissions show continued greenhouse gas emissions well into the middle half of our century. So this is a graph that was put together by the United Nations Environment Program about 8 years ago, meant to sort of illustrate the different kinds of solutions that we have at our disposal for addressing climate change. So this yellow line corresponds to a trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis of this graph, under sort of a business as usual scenario. And in this scenario, we don't stop leveling off our emissions till the later part of the current century. But of course, we're aiming for a below 2 degree increase in temperature over the current century. And this, of course, requires us changing our energy system to some extent, actually in a massive extent. So you can imagine that most of the difference between our business as usual greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions that will keep us on a below 2 degree target can be achieved by transforming our energy system from emitting technology towards nuclear, solar, wind, solar, and so on. And that can do the bulk of the heavy lifting here. But as you'll notice in this graph, it doesn't get us to net zero emissions. And that's because there are certain parts of our economy that are just very hard to decarbonize. So we think of plane travel, for example, is a good example of that. Air travel, very hard to decarbonize, or at least decarbonization requires a massive cost. And there's other things that are much less technologically exciting, like livestock, which we expect to continue to have, that will emit in the future. So agriculture is a major source of our emissions, and these kinds of agricultural emissions are going to be very, very hard to reverse. This doesn't mean we can't get to net zero, however. It just means that we're going to have some net negative emissions to offset those positive emissions to get us in this graph to net zero in the year 2090. So what are these net negative emissions? So most of you are familiar with, for example, with direct air capture. So the idea is that we can use chemical reactions to scrub the air of CO2 and pump the captured CO2 below ground and keep it out of our atmosphere. This is a great way for getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. But the problem is that at current economy scales, it's very expensive. We don't view this as being sort of a massively deployable solution today at the costs that are deployable. And in addition, it's not clear that we can deploy this at the massive scale that's required to actually achieve net zero, at least at the timescales that we need to for example, the Paris Agreement goals. But we do have solutions that are not so expensive and can be deployed at massive scales today. And these involve plants. So this is from a National Academy of Science report produced about 6 years ago. And what you can imagine is that we can pull CO2 through a lot of solutions that are not so fancy. So for example, if we reforest areas, we have large areas of meadow that we allow trees to recover within. These are areas that are not carbon dense today, but will actually store huge amounts of carbon in the wood of the trees. We can also imagine doing sort of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So we can use plants to capture CO2 from our atmosphere and then burn those plants in a plant, which helps offset, for example, fossil emissions or fossil energy. But even more so, we can capture those emissions and pump those below ground into geologic reservoirs. We can also imagine doing different kinds of agricultural practices, enhanced chemical weathering. We can also manage forests on a longer time interval to store more carbon. So these are the kinds of readily available solutions that we can deploy today, but we want to understand the biodiversity impacts. So with this, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jeff, because this was sort of his baby, and I want him to share his screen so he can drive the presentation, and we can go from there.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everybody, for coming to hear us share a little bit about our work today, and hopefully this will share well. Great. So you're able to see my screen now? Great. Yes. So I'll just pick off sort of just where, excuse me, where Jonathan left off, and talk a little bit about a subset of these solutions that Jonathan was highlighting. And in particular today, I'm going to be focusing on reforestation, afforestation, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And as Jonathan said, really trying to understand how these solutions might affect biodiversity, and in fact, if they will actually help benefit biodiversity. One of the main motivations for addressing climate change is certainly to help stave off the loss of species. There's lots of other reasons that we should be addressing climate change, but this is certainly something that we need to keep in the back of the mind, that these things will likely help biodiversity by helping to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And these three solutions together, reforestation, afforestation, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, are expected to be among the largest by area that we're going to be deploying in the coming decades. And they're also really likely to have profound impacts for biodiversity because they really fundamentally change the habitat. If you think about replacing, as Jonathan said, a meadow with a forest, you can see that that's really fundamentally a different habitat. The same types of animals that are likely to live in a forest are quite different from those that are likely to live in a meadow. Similarly, if we convert a native prairie to a bioenergy field, a lot of species that might have been able to use that prairie as habitat may no longer be able to use that bioenergy field. In contrast, forest management, managing soil carbon and agriculture are still likely to be important sources of carbon dioxide uptake from the atmosphere, but we don't sort of have the same a priori expectation that they're really going to fundamentally change the habitat available to species. And that sort of preludes what I think are the main objectives that I had going into this paper, which are to understand these potentially dual impacts of land-based climate solutions on biodiversity. And the first one that I've highlighted already is that we think these solutions are likely to fundamentally reshape the habitat available to species. So in the cases that we're going to be considering today, we'll be thinking about converting some sort of open natural habitat, think grassland, shrubland, savannas, and converting that into either a forested habitat, in the case of reforestation and afforestation, or a bioenergy cropland, in the case of bioenergy cropping with carbon capture and storage. And as I've already highlighted, these are likely to change the types of species that are able to make use of that particular parcel of land as habitat. They're not going to be able to necessarily find the same nesting and food resources. They're not necessarily going to be able to complete their life cycle in the same way in these different habitats. And the other reason that we're focusing on reforestation, afforestation, and bioenergy cropping is because humans for the past 100+ years have been doing a lot to change the way that our landscapes are structured. We've cut down a lot of forests and turned them into agricultural areas. We've converted a lot of existing open habitats into various different types of agricultural land. So we have this really strong wealth of knowledge that's been curated by the IUCN, which basically can tell us what the different habitat affinities species might have for these different habitat classes might be. So that's another reason to focus on these three. But as we've also alluded to, we expect that biodiversity is going to respond quite strongly to climate change as the decades go on. However, we therefore would also expect it to respond if we were to take steps to help mitigate that climate change intensity. So I think the easiest way to think about this in my mind is we expect for the coming decades, many species might see their ranges contract with climate change. And this is something that Jonathan was sort of highlighting with some of these alpine plant communities where they might be sort of losing the amount of climatically suitable habitat under various pathways of climate change. But if we take steps to sort of mitigate the intensity of the climate change, we'll also sort of lessen the stress that these species might face in terms of their range contractions. But this ends up, in my mind, as an ecologist, a really interesting paradigm where, depending on the strength and directionality of these two arrows, both for species and then also various locations on Earth, we might expect very different potential outcomes for biodiversity if these habitat conversion effects, which we expect to be quite strong for many species that are found locally, are either stronger or weaker than these climate feedbacks that we're likely to see as well. And right now, this is somewhat of an abstract graphic. So I think it's really helpful to walk through how we're going to do this using a single species. And for this, I'm going to use the moose. And so here we have a nice moose standing somewhere up in the northern Rockies. And I'm just going to walk through the methodological approach, and feel free to interrupt if you have questions, because it's going to be really essential to understanding the results that we're going to show. So I want to make sure that we're sort of starting from the same page. And so the approach that we start with basically says, what would a world look like in the year 2050 if we didn't deploy any land-based climate change mitigation strategies? So you'll see this term LBM that comes up on the side here. That basically just stands for land-based climate change mitigation strategies. We've just dropped a couple of C's there. And the approach that we use is essentially a form of species distribution modeling. In this case, we're using Maxent, which is based on principles of maximum entropy. There's a number of other species distribution models out there that I'd be happy to talk more about with people offline if they're interested. But we essentially can leverage the observations of where the moose is found today under current climatic conditions and pair it with data that we have from the IPCC about bioclimatically relevant information, such as mean annual temperature, the seasonality of temperature, how much rainfall, precipitation, snowfall a given place receives, how many consecutive dry days there are as sort of a proxy for drought, and basically generate these statistical relationships which say, these are the environmental variables which seem to structure the current day distribution of the moose. And then using projections of climate change and how those bioclimatic variables are likely to change in the year 2050. And here I'm using SSP2 RCP 4.5 for those of you who are curious. We can basically see where the moose's range might move to in the year 2050. And that's sort of going to be a baseline we're going to use throughout this presentation as sort of a track of what the world looks like without these sort of wide-scale deployment of land-based mitigation measures. But as you can see here, this gold box includes potentially lots of different habitats. And we know that moose tend to prefer to live in forests. And this is leveraging, as I said earlier, these IUCN habitat affinity scores that have been developed by experts over many decades. And we have a really good intuition that moose really rely heavily on forested lands for their life cycle. While we might occasionally see them in meadows, that often is just because it's easier to see a moose standing in the middle of a grassland than a moose standing in the middle of a forest. But what we can do is basically say, within this bioclimatically suitable range drawn in this goldenrod color, where are the areas that the moose would consider to be a viable habitat class? And so here, these would just be forested classes. So we can basically find the intersection of the bioclimatically suitable range and the habitats that that moose is able to make use of to complete its life cycle. And the intersection of those two things will essentially give us this area of habitat. And that's going to be a metric I'm going to come back to a bit throughout the presentation, which is basically saying in the year 2050, without the deployment of land-based mitigation strategies, what might the area of habitat for the moose be? And that's going to be this hypothetical baseline against which we're going to do some sort of natural or some experiments within this modeling framework. And in particular, we're going to look at a couple of experiments where we deploy land-based mitigation strategies in the year 2020 and let them basically accrue biomass for the next 30 years. And so we'll be doing, as I've said, reforestation, afforestation, and bioenergy cropping. And what's interesting in my mind is that these strategies are going to do two things at the same time. But what we're going to do is isolate both of those effects so we can look at them independently, compare them to one another, and then at the end, combine them. So we'll be tracking these things in a common currency, which allows us to directly compare different effects that they might have on biodiversity. So the first thing that these land-based mitigation measures are going to do is it's going to add or remove habitat. So in the case that I'm showing here, we're considering reforestation. So you can see there's this little green dotted circle where I've added this tree to the side of this oval. And this essentially, without changing the bioclimatic envelope of the moose, you can see that this goldenrod box has not shifted from panel B to panel C. All we've done is added more forest cover. And in the case of the moose likes this forest. It basically says, I'm really happy that you've converted some more grassland into forest for me. And that basically is this habitat conversion effect. So the habitat conversion effect of adding forest cover in this pixel or in this region for the moose was positive. You could imagine if you're a little kangaroo mouse or an open habitat specialist that prefers to live in grassland, this same exact intervention could result in a negative habitat conversion effect. So that's going to be something that's going to become important later on. But when we think about the conversion of open habitats to forest habitats, it's logical to think that many species who rely on forests will benefit from this habitat conversion. But we also have to keep in mind that a lot of open habitat specialists will actually lose habitat as we convert grasslands, or as we rather allow grasslands to regenerate to forests. And so what this is doing essentially is allowing us to isolate the effect of just the habitat conversion effect of deploying land-based climate strategies. But of course, that's not even why we're deploying these land-based climate change strategies. What we're really hoping to do with these is to change the climate. And so you can see the other effect on the right-hand side of this schematic, which we can essentially use these mitigation measures to help mitigate the intensity of climate change. And one way to visualize this is you can see this box that is now drawn in this bluer to purple shade rather than this blue to red shade above. We've essentially somewhat cooled the climate. And again, the exact amount of cooling is going to depend on how these strategies are being employed, where they're being deployed. But we can essentially, for this hypothetical, say we've somewhat cooled the climate, and that's going to allow the moose's bioclimatic envelope to shift. This orange, or this goldenrod color will shift to the right. But how exactly do we even figure out how that's going to happen? In the case of adding forest cover, it's really easy to say, we added this much forest cover in the range of the moose, and therefore we can just sort of additively say, this is how much forest cover was gained and how much habitat was gained for the moose. But you can imagine that figuring out these climate impacts is quite a bit more complicated, and indeed it was. But I'm just going to quickly walk through this process of how we did this, and again, happy to take questions either as we go or at the end, and feel free to follow up with email. But we essentially start for any given intervention in any given location with basically the easiest way to think about what a land-based mitigation measure does, is calculating how much carbon it's sequestering. So in the case of reforestation and afforestation, this is the amount of carbon that's being sequestered in the wood that stands above ground, in the roots that are below ground. In the case of bioenergy cropping, it's a little bit more complicated. It has to do with the amount of carbon that they're offsetting from the energy system. It has to do with the amount of fertilizer being deployed. But essentially, we can convert all of this to the amount of carbon that's being traded, or that's being gained or lost from the atmosphere because of this deployment of these solutions. And from this amount of carbon that's being sequestered through, for this case, the deployment of forest, we can track the potential reduction in atmospheric CO2. So while the deployment of any given hectare or square kilometer of forest is unlikely to really reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by a lot, if we were to deploy these land-based mitigation measures at scale, we could in fact make a really meaningful reduction in the atmospheric CO2 concentrations. We can then use principles coming from atmospheric sciences to understand how the change in atmospheric CO2 will change the radiative forcing of the atmosphere. And that basically is what's moving us between these different RCP pathways. So the difference between RCP 4.5 and RCP 2.6 is essentially a measure of the change in the radiative forcing of the atmosphere. And why we care about the change in the radiative forcing is because that also directly feeds into the change in the global mean temperature. So essentially, this is the variable that we frequently talk about with a 1.5 degree target or a 2 degrees Celsius target, where we're saying we want to limit the change in global mean temperature to this threshold. But we also know that these are unlikely to be homogeneous, or are almost certainly not homogeneous effects over all of Earth. We in fact know that the Arctic, for example, is warming faster than the tropics. We also know that a lot of other climatic variables are likely to shift alongside changes in global mean temperature. As Jonathan alluded to earlier, precipitation patterns are also likely to change. And what we can use are these downscaled statistical models, which will essentially say for any given region on Earth, and IPCC designates, I think, 58 different regions on Earth, what is the relationship between mean global warming level and all of the bioclimatic variables that we've used to model the moose's distribution? And once we sort of update those climatic variables, we can now calculate this new climatically suitable range. So this is sort of this process that's being done for every single intervention around Earth, for every single species, where we say this allows the moose's bioclimatic envelope to sort of shift to the right in this schematic. And what that potentially does is essentially open up potentially new habitats for the moose that previously existed in terms of the habitat was available, but were climatically unsuitable. It essentially just shifts the potential alignment between the current day habitat availability and the bioclimatic suitability. And again, you can imagine cases where the climate mitigation effect for a given species is negative, if that causes this sort of bioclimatic envelope to shift further away from more suitable habitats. But in the majority of cases, we would expect this to sort of bring it more in line with the suitable habitats. I'm going to pause briefly in case anybody has any questions, because I know that this is sort of a lot to take in.
Yeah, there's a lot of details. Actually, for LBMS, the most of the treatments are kind of fake forests because that's all you can, artificially plant. So you're going to put a bunch of pine trees, but without all the other species that go along with them. How do you deal with that, let's say, novel forest type?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something I probably should have highlighted earlier. The approach that we're showing here is assuming essentially natural forest regeneration. And so this is based on Susan Cook-Patton's paper out of 2020, which essentially says we're going to change management regimes to allow the establishment of forests. So it's either changes in the amount of disturbance, suppressing fires, preventing herbivores from grazing it, but essentially allowing forests to naturally recruit. And this is likely to lead to much lower carbon returns or carbon sequestration than you would expect if you were to, say, plant tree pine plantations. But it also is like, in the effect that we're modeling here, is more likely to be similar to a naturally regenerating forest. It is actually something that we're currently in the process of adding into the model that we've built so far, is what if we actually explicitly allowed for plantation forestry as a separate class? And that's something that we do actually have a reasonably good grasp on. And some of the early results that we're seeing is that if you were to use forest plantations in place of natural forest regeneration, the potential benefits for biodiversity are just much worse than you might otherwise get.
Okay, so then, all right, so how will you quantify biodiversity? Because that's an interesting one. And we're going to ask you two questions. There is a possibility of plantation forestry being more stable if it's biodiverse. However you you quantify biodiversity, because it's maybe more resilient to pests and whatnot. Versus, like, you might, if it's more plantation-y and really not biodiverse, might get carbon a lot initially and then die. So how do you quantify the effect and the interaction with carbon?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the first one, everything that I'm going to talk about today is going to be measured in change in mean area of habitat. So that's essentially saying, for all species everywhere on the globe, does this particular intervention change the mean area of habitat? So here, that's basically just the difference between this oval here and this oval here, or this oval here and this oval here. So we're essentially just saying, if the amount of habitat available to vertebrate species went up or down on average, sort of across all species globally. That's obviously not the only way to do this. There's lots of other ways that you could prioritize, say, threatened and endangered species, and just do this for a subset of species that we think are likely to be at risk. There's different ways that you could do it based on the phylogenetic relatedness of species, trying to conserve different species depending on how distinct they are from other species. This was just sort of the first pass that we've taken at this. So we sort of said, for simplicity, we're going to just focus on mean area of habitat for vertebrates, basically how much habitat intersects the bioclimatically suitable range for vertebrates, and does this intervention make that go up or down? In some future work, we're really excited to explore some future other additional metrics of biodiversity. For the second question about how we might think about permanence, this is something that I think is becoming really topical, and there's a lot of really interesting modeling in, say, the fire literature that I think could also probably be used in a pest outbreak type of literature, where we can essentially introduce some sort of uncertainty or probability of loss, and probability of loss in terms of both habitat available to species, but then also carbon. In this particular example, we've essentially said over this 30-year time horizon, we're assuming permanence in the amount of carbon being sequestered, as well as the new habitats that are being established. But I think that's another really exciting future direction to take this work, and basically relaxing that assumption of permanence.
Okay, got it. And then the one last question is farms. A lot of mitigations are, promoting either switchgrass type of crops, which changes things, or changing the soil patterns of crops, of farms, maybe regenerative ag, which will affect microbial, fungal, bug populations. How does that interact?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. It's something that here we haven't thought too much about how changing different crop systems is likely to affect this. What we're currently thinking about is if you were to create novel croplands or to retire existing croplands. But you're absolutely right that changing from one type of management of a cropland to a different type could have big climate effects. I think one of the struggles that we have right now, and this is sort of a lack of understanding both on the front part of ecologists and agronomists, is we have really large uncertainties about what different management practices are likely to do to soil carbon. I think while we have some sense of what we think the general directionality of the trend might be, the uncertainty around a lot of these interventions is so high that we can't really draw meaningful conclusions that are sort of ubiquitously true across different locations. I think also in the case of biodiversity, we don't have a good sense of how species might be responding to these different interventions. So I've heard a lot recently about biochar and some really large acquisitions of biochar-based projects for nitrogen removal, or for CO2 removal on farmlands. And we don't necessarily know what that's going to mean for vertebrate species. We could probably make some guesses as to how it might affect plants, but there's a lot of uncertainty that's going to have to be addressed, and it's something I'm going to get to at the very end of my talk, with some of these solutions that are newer. So more technology-based solutions like enhanced chemical weathering, biochar, wind and solar, that we just don't have the same breadth of ecological literature to draw from.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we can basically calculate this habitat conversion effect, which affects only those species that sort of intersect the range of where a land-based mitigation project is being deployed. The moose is only going to care if you're putting forest in the Yukon. It's not going to care if you're putting forest in the Amazon. So it really only matters for those species whose ranges intersect those projects, but it's likely to be quite large for those species. In contrast, the moose doesn't really care where the climate mitigation effects are being generated. The moose is perfectly happy if you're generating these climate stabilization benefits by planting trees in Southeast Asia. So you have this interesting potential trade-off between these large local effects that are operating through habitat for a subset of species that are found in those habitats versus these small, potentially small climatically driven effects that affect every species on the globe, not just those species that are found in that location. And I think that sets up this like interesting trade-off from an ecology point of view, where when we go from a single species to nearly 15,000 species, we can start to get a sense of how these things might play out across space. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to walk through the habitat conversion effects, because I feel that those are somewhat more intuitive to walk through, where we can essentially say, if we were to convert an open habitat to forest cover in different locations across Earth, what would that mean for mean area of habitat? And again, this is the response variable that we're using to quantify biodiversity. A rough proxy in this case would essentially be an increase in mean area of habitat is similar to an increase in species richness. Obviously, the units here are somewhat hard to understand in that direct context, but that's because of this mean variable. It's just dividing these into very small units. But what's important to show here, and I think is a really interesting and cool pattern, is that all of the areas in blue are basically areas where we expect the conversion of grassland, savanna, and shrubland to benefit biodiversity, to increase the amount of habitat available to species. And you can see that these areas are falling in really strong alignment with these black hashed marks, which I'm realizing might show up not as well on some people's screens, depending on the coloring. But essentially, these represent historically forested biomes. These are the regions of Earth where forests were historically expected based on climatic and soil conditions. And here, these historically forested biomes are drawn entirely independent of any of the coloration of this pattern that we're showing here. There's basically nothing from these forest biomes that's influencing our results. But what this basically shows us is if you're adding trees to historically forested biomes, this is likely to provide a benefit for biodiversity. So I don't think that's necessarily the most novel finding. Reforestation is good for biodiversity is something I think we all would have hoped to have been true going in. But what I think is really interesting to show here is how quickly, once you get out of these forested biomes, the potential cost or the potential biodiversity harms of planting trees or allowing trees to recolonize is quite large. So the two places where it's easiest to see this are in the Cerrado of Brazil here, as well as in the savannas of Africa. And you can think about this as perhaps a lion. If I'm a lion or many of these other iconic savanna-dwelling species, if my habitat is being displaced by the planting of trees in the hope to sequester carbon, I might not necessarily care about that relatively small amount of carbon as much as I'm going to care about the potential losses in habitat that are being driven by the planting of trees. We can see that the case for bioenergy crops is a little bit easier to understand even than the case for forests. In almost every place where bioenergy crops could be deployed, they lead to a loss of habitat for biodiversity. There are a few areas shown here in very light blue, that are in really historically forested biomes where it leads to a slight increase. If we flip back here, you can see that you would get much more value if you were to instead convert those into forest. But here, due to some quirks in the modeling that I'd be happy to talk about, if people have questions about that, feel free to reach out. We just see that it's not nearly as positive. I'm now going to flip to talking a little bit about the climate mitigation effects, realizing that we're coming up close to the end of time here. And the one thing I'm going to have you keep an eye on is this color bar on the right-hand side. We're going to actually go from being on an e to the -3 magnitude to an e to the -4 magnitude. And so basically here, we're seeing two things. First, the order of magnitude has dropped by a factor of 10, or the effect size has dropped by a factor of 10 here. But what's also interesting, and this is something that I've alluded to already, is that no matter where carbon sequestration is realized across the globe, the biodiversity benefits are positive. And this gets back to the case of the moose, is that the moose is going to benefit from climate stabilization, whether or not carbon is being sequestered in the Amazon or across the Congo Basin. And so here what the color pattern is actually representing is just the efficacy of that particular location at helping to mitigate climate change. So perhaps not surprisingly, trees grow best in the tropics, and therefore we're likely to see these strong benefits of planting trees in the tropics for helping to stabilize biodiversity. In the case of bioenergy cropping, we see slightly higher values, and in particular, higher values for those areas where we have these long-term sedimentary basins. So one of the assumptions we made in this model is that carbon capture and storage associated with bioenergy cropping is only likely to happen in those places in close proximity to a sedimentary basin where you can directly inject that CO2 after you've stored it for long-term sequestration. That's obviously an assumption that we made, and there could be build out of CO2 transmission infrastructure in the future. But you can essentially see that by sequestering the carbon after burning the bioenergy crops, you're essentially able to double the potential benefits to biodiversity. And so this is all, I think, potentially interesting in that it's showing us two things, sort of the net effect in isolation, but also that the habitat conversion effects tend to be a lot larger than these climate stabilization effects. But at the end of the day, what we really care about is if we're a practitioner or a land manager and we're trying to address climate change and trying to help biodiversity, what does this mean for us? So what I want to do is put all of these pieces together in a final figure, which essentially asks if you were to deploy one of these two strategies to help benefit biodiversity, which one should you deploy? And again, I'll say here, there's many reasons to address climate change, not only for the protection of biodiversity. And likewise, there's lots of reasons to potentially deploy these various solutions that might have very little to do with climate change. So in the case of bioenergy crops, those can create livelihoods for many local communities. And so this is just very narrowly asking, if your goal is to maximize biodiversity outcomes, which of these two strategies should you deploy? And you can see here that the areas in light green and light yellow are not necessarily as interesting, in my opinion, because that's just saying only one of these two is biophysically possible. What's more interesting, in my opinion, is these areas where in dark green or dark orange, one solution is preferred to the other. And you can see in those cases, and I think the number off the top of my head is about 88 to 90% of those cases, adding tree cover is preferred to bioenergy cropping when we're thinking about this from a biodiversity perspective. But I think the most important take home from this whole paper is that in many cases of the world, if we add a fifth option, just leave the current habitat intact, leave the native grassland, savanna, and shrubland intact, that's actually the best option for biodiversity. And this overlays almost all of these large areas where afforestation or bioenergy cropping are the preferred solution, which essentially is suggesting that the habitat loss associated with those solutions is just much more consequential for the biodiversity than any benefits that biodiversity is likely to receive from an indirect pathway that's going through this mitigated climate change. So just to quickly summarize here, a couple of main take-homes being, first, that the habitat conversion effect is really driving what species are going to do in response to these land-based mitigation measures. Second, that reforestation is likely to provide a win-win for biodiversity. We're likely to create habitat for species and also help mitigate climate change. And third, that the habitat losses associated with afforestation or bioenergy cropping are just much larger than the benefits that species get from this mitigated climate, and therefore aren't likely to be beneficial for biodiversity. Just to quickly wrap up and then open up to questions, one of the things that Jonathan and I are really excited about moving forward is something that's come up on this call already, is we only looked at 3 of these interventions. There's dozens of different ways that we're going to help address climate change. One that we're really excited about moving forward is solar panels, and in particular because recent work has shown that solar panels per unit area might be up to 30 times as effective at reducing carbon dioxide. And all of a sudden, that order of magnitude that we lost in the previous slide, I just found that. So it gets this really interesting possibility of, if we have a better sense of how biodiversity might respond to the deployment of solar panels, both in terms of what they do for climate change and habitat, that's a really important step. But this is something that we don't have a lot of ecological data, and a lot's going to depend on getting a better understanding of what solar panels mean for biodiversity, what different types of solar farms might mean for biodiversity. And this is something that we're hoping to use some machine learning and potentially AI approaches going forward to have a better sense of, with the data that's already exists, can we come up with these types of habitat affinity scores that we think we need to do this approach? And with that, I'll sort of thank a few people and open it up to everyone for questions.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. One question I have is, for your recommendations you are making, what climate scenario we're looking for? I guess how bad of the climate impacts we're facing given the alternatives?
Yeah, so the scenario that we modeled here was an RCP 4.5 pathway. You could take the same approach and do it for any of these other pathways. I would expect that if we were to use the RCP 8.80 or whatever it was, the climate mitigation effects would probably be stronger there than they would likely be otherwise. I don't think that the choice of pathway necessarily is going to influence sort of the main sort of qualitative nature of the results, but it'll certainly change a lot about the quantitative relationship between some of these values.
Okay, and then other bio-based mechanisms, something like biochar, which should sequester more carbon per original crop, right?
Yeah.
And dump it back on the farm. How did that family, affect the conclusions?
Yeah, I think this is something that we really need more ground truth studies to have a sense of. And I think in the case of vertebrates, it's potentially the most challenging. And this is, I think, a place where a lot of the experimental approaches that Jonathan has used with, like, say, annual plants might be something that we can sort of leverage as a way to sort of experimentally test various levels of biochar and then do biodiversity surveys on the ground.
Right.
It's something that I think is going to be unsatisfying in that it's not something, a lot of what I currently do is trying to, like, scale things with remote sensing and trying to use satellite imagery to do this. And for both biochar and enhanced chemical weathering, we've thought a lot about it, but we've really struggled to come up with a way to do the large-scale biodiversity monitoring that we think we need to get a better sense of what those habitat-based effects are going to be. Got
it. And one last one is water usage scarcity going to have a significant impact on the land management conclusions? Yeah, this is absolutely a huge one. It's something that, while we were going through the reviews for this paper, it comes up a lot, especially in the case of afforestation, but is likely to also be true in bioenergy cropping. And it's something that I think is going to be really important, and I think it will likely be really important for a lot of these technology-based ones that I sort of laid out at the end as exciting frontiers. It's something that we haven't incorporated yet, but I think, especially given the rise of demands of water for data cooling centers and AI types of things, it's only going to become more important. So I think it's something that I would be really open to incorporating in the future. I think it might have to be sort of a third axis that we're thinking about: carbon on one axis and water on another axis and biodiversity on another axis, which makes it a harder problem, but perhaps a more interesting scientifically and also more useful practically type of problem to do. So I'd be excited to do that. Yeah, fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you very much. It was really enlightening. Thank you all for having us.